Hello. You'll forgive the lack of spit and polish. I am not a professional YouTuber, but I am a concerned citizen, and I have a certain expertise in modelling pandemics. A very limited expertise. I don't claim to be the expert that many working in this field are, but I spent 2 years working as a very junior civil servant. And a large part of my job was modelling infectious diseases, and particularly pandemic influenza. So I have some expertise in the area. And obviously, I can't comment upon a lot of that because of the Official Secrets Act and because of just generally good practice. Um, Nor can I talk about my experiences more generally without um, as it is, but I can go through the published documentation with you relating to this current SARS-CoV-2 or the corona pandemic, as it's more commonly known, and walk through it with you step by step, dissecting it critically and analytically, because I think there's a lot of fear around at the moment. There's a lot of people who are finding lockdown in the UK incredibly hard, and I think it's a public service to help inform people, to help people be a little bit less worried, a little bit better informed. As I've been saying, I think that people would much better be informed than in fear. And I think that I can help with that just a little bit. And I think it's quite therapeutic for me. So please do be understanding if I ramble quite a bit. I am going to try and take this as a nice, gentle pace. And I am going to potentially break this up into multiple sections because I've bitten off a lot more than I can chew. I reviewed some of the material earlier today and found that actually there's quite a lot of it. So we're not going to start with the large amount of modelling that has been released by Imperial College London, or the large amount of material that's been published on the government's website supporting the under the SAGE banner, supporting their advice to the government. No, we're going to start prior to that with a document I'm incredibly familiar with, the SPY-M modelling summary. SPY-M is a group, a committee of academics, joint held with the Department of Health, that advises on the preparation for influenza pandemics and national planning for influenza pandemics. And they have a publicly published report that they keep up, and it's a working document. They perpetually update it on a regular basis. And it's a really good snapshot of what the thinking in government was prior to this pandemic. And I think that that is a good place to begin in helping people get grounded in what's going on here. This is going to be somewhat academic in tone, but I'm not going to go into very complicated mathematics, certainly not from the get-go. But we are going to burn through a lot of jargon here, so you should make yourselves comfortable with some of the terminology early on that we're going to dig into right now, because it's going to crop up again and again and again. So without further ado, I've highlighted select sections of the document, and we should be able to go through it together, and I will do my best to try and put it in layman's terms and to try and explain what some of the implications and rationales and the context around this document is. So, as you can see, it's prepared by the Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Modelling. This is a subcommittee of a much larger committee that used to exist but doesn't anymore. And it's quite extensive. We won't have time to go through all of it, so we will skip through sections. But it's important to understand the rationale that sits behind this group's advice. And I think it's probably true of a lot of the academic advice that's given to the government. And I'll read this out for you. However, other factors such as practicality, proportionality, and questions of value for money are also important in the generation of an effective policy. These factors are outside the remit of the subgroup. When relevant, modelling of such factors is a responsibility of the Department of Health and Social Care's analytical teams and similar groups in other government departments. So what that was saying is actually this group is only really interested in talking about pandemics, their impact, how you can mitigate a pandemic, what the effectiveness of various strategies for mitigating a pandemic might be. It's not interested in looking at questions of the other side of the coin. How much do your preparations cost? If you spend a certain amount of money preparing for a pandemic, um, what is the cost to the NHS if that money is coming out of the NHS budget? How many people are not getting their chemotherapy because you've bought a lot of drug A that you might never use or that you might find isn't appropriate for the pandemic you eventually get? These are questions that they specifically do not consider within their remit. And it's kind of important to understand that they've got a very narrow defined scope that they've got here in their brief. The focus of this paper is on the modelling results for significant pandemics, of which there were 3 in the 20th century: 1918 to 19, 1957 to 58, and 1968 to 69. Such significant pandemics result in a relatively large number of people becoming clinically ill, suffering complications, requiring hospitalization, and dying. The more recent H1N1 2009 pandemic had a considerably lower impact. The policy importance of the 2009 outbreak was an exemplar of an event which, at least in its early development, is difficult to distinguish from a much more significant epidemic. So, what they're saying there is that one way to look at pandemics, their significance and their impact, is to look at historical pandemics, because pandemics are a historical fact. There have been 3 in the 20th century, 3 influenza pandemics. The 1918 pandemic is a famous Spanish flu, which was particularly deadly and caused a lot of suffering, and came immediately after the First World War, of course, or during the end of the First World War. Um, but there have been 3 of them as recently as the late 60s. So that's, some of your older parents, some of your grandparents will remember the 60s. They were at Woodstock. They weren't, almost certainly, but there will be people who remember the 60s, who you will have met and you will have talked to. And obviously they've lived through it. They've come out the other end and may survived. But of course the 1918 pandemic was a particularly nasty one. And we shall see quantifiably how nasty based upon this research. But the point is, those pandemics were at a time pre-internet, pre-high-tech, lots and lots of high-tech lab tests that we could roll out on a relatively large scale. The 2009 pandemic was a modern pandemic. It was a technologically addressed pandemic. And quite a lot of you won't even remember it as a pandemic because, frankly, it really wasn't that impactful. People have erroneously referred to the 2019 COVID-19 pandemic as little worse than seasonal flu, and that's absolute tosh. But the 2009 pandemic, some people might argue, was not that much worse than seasonal flu. And yet at the early stages, the very early stages, it wasn't possible to tell that it was necessarily going to be that mild. It is intrinsically very hard to tell in the very early stages of a pandemic, based purely upon the very, very early case data, how bad a pandemic is going to be, particularly if its situations are moving at a very fast rate and information is kind of scarce, which it can be. So it's worth considering this. One way of looking at pandemics is by comparison to the pandemics historically, modeling them, looking at how we would fit a model to the historical data, and trying to get a sense of how probable these pandemics are based upon what we've seen in the past. This is a philosophy that you will see repeated in this document, this kind of reference to history. So, novel viruses and bacteria are continuously emerging, and the exact nature and timing of the next epidemic/pandemic is impossible to predict. That's absolutely true. People who work with pandemics, who work in the field of pandemics, are not surprised that this pandemic happened. There may be many aspects of this pandemic that surprise them, but we always knew, and I think anyone who has looked at the history of pandemics will have agreed, that it was always a question of when, not if. When had. We had 3 pandemics last century. Based on that, you would expect there'd be about a 3% chance of there being a pandemic in any given year. And that may sound really low, but over the course of 100 years, you don't necessarily go that long before you see one. Your chance of seeing one in your lifetime is pretty high. So we're going to go through the 3 pandemics, historically speaking. We're going to do a bit of background on the information about them and their relative severity. In the UK, there were 3 waves associated with the 1918 pandemic. The wave structure of this pandemic is not well understood. Now, we've all heard a lot about waves, first waves, second waves, so on. The 1918 pandemic was one of those that had waves. And particularly its second wave was particularly nasty in terms of the numbers dying. That may not necessarily be because there was any kind of effective suppression, as we've been hearing in the press recently, but we do understand that pandemics do occasionally have waves, and there are a number of different theories about it. But one theory is that as situations change throughout the year, the propensity of a pandemic to spread can go up and down. And that can be affected by people's health, it can be affected by the movement of people around, it can be affected by social distancing, it can be affected by the weather. Influenza is heavily affected by the weather, and the time of year in terms of the seasonality. It can be affected by numerous different things. It can be affected by school holidays, among other things, as we will find out. The final 1919 wave may have been a separate pandemic of a different virus to the 1918 waves. Again, it's worth remembering that you can have pandemics overlapping, you can have interaction of pandemics, and you can also have pandemics that mutate. I don't believe it's in this document, but I do recall reading somewhere that when the 1918 pandemic got to Australia, which took a while, back in those days when international travel was a little bit less widespread, it was less deadly. Australia didn't see the number of fatalities that the rest of the world would have been expected to see, but of course Australia's introduction to the pandemic was a lot later. And one argument for the potential reasons for this is that it may have mutated to become less lethal. But of course, as a pandemic mutates, that also means that sometimes, just sometimes, you can get a new strain which might be infectious to people who've maybe already had the previous strain. We don't really understand to what extent that is the case. There's arguments either way. but it is something to keep in mind. The smallest of the waves was in July-August 1918. The largest second wave was from October 1918 to January 1919, and the third wave was from February to April 1919. Estimates of the national clinical attack rate vary. Clinical attack rate is a very important figure. Its technical meaning is effectively the number of people who get the virus and get sick. So it's not the people who get infected who are asymptomatic. Some of them will be asymptomatic. Some of them will. It's not the people who die. It's not the people who get very sick. It's the people who get sick enough that a doctor would be expected to diagnose them with the virus, with the pandemic virus. So it's the people who get sick. They get sick in such a way that is typical of a virus, that is going to be picked up by a doctor, and that is going to cause them to be diagnosed. They are a clinical case. So the clinical attack rate is more or less the percentage of people who you would expect to be diagnosed with the pandemic virus throughout the entire course of a pandemic. So estimates of the national clinical attack rate vary, but suggest nationally it was around 25% of the population totaled over all waves. The highest clinical attack rates were seen in the young. So that is to say, lots of young people were diagnosed as being ill. Estimates of the case fatality ratio are around 2%. Now, the case fatality ratio is, again, not the number of people who die of the pandemic. It is the number of people who are diagnosed who then go on to die of the pandemic. That's a very important point, because there might be a small number of people who have the infection who never get diagnosed. They have a very atypical presentation. Maybe they're never tested. And there might be a very small number of people who actually do get diagnosed if there's a lot of asymptomatic individuals. But if they have a very high case fatality ratio, you could have a lot of deaths nonetheless. So the case fatality ratio is the ratio, the number of people who have been diagnosed or might expect to be diagnosed and then go on to die. And that was around 2%. It's not to say 2% of the population died. Relatively evenly spread across the population, though with an excess in young adults. Now the case fatality ratio spread. If there is an excess of cases in young adults, but the case fatality ratio is evenly spread, that will of course mean that you'll get more deaths among young adults, because that even spread of the case fatality ratio is then applied on top of the fact that you've got a concentration of young people getting the illness. In the UK, just to take a moment to talk about that, that's atypical for influenza. Influenza is typically a disease of the old. We see that seasonally speaking in seasonal flu. The thing that was considered unusual about the 1918 pandemic was the number of young people dying from it, the number of young people falling ill from it. That was considered quite peculiar. You get this very unusual kind of death curve where you have your typical spike of infant mortality, where you get the very, very young who are experiencing quite high mortality. That's quite not unusual. Then you get the quite old who are experiencing elevated mortality. That's again very usual with influenza. But in pandemic flu and Spanish flu, there was this kind of peak around young men. And that has been theorized to be something to do with the fact that there was a world war, there were a lot of ill men coming home from the front and a lot of movement, but it also may have something to do with immune systems and have something to do with the way that the pandemic, the Spanish flu pandemic, may have been very much bound up with the effect of cytokine storms and That is to say, the overreaction of the immune system's tendency to kind of go into an overdrive, overreact to the presence of the influenza, and to actually damage a body. And of course, young people might have a more aggressive, more healthy, more robust immune system, but also maybe perhaps some people, some experts have argued, might be more inclined to go over the top and cause damage to the body. And people still argue about this, and papers are still written about this to this day. We may even go through some of those papers at some point. But we'll see. This is more about corona. In the UK, the 1957-58 pandemic came in one wave, with most of the deaths occurring from September to February. Estimates of the national clinical attack rate vary, but suggest nationally it was around 30% of the population. Estimates of the case fatality ratio are around 0.1 to 0.2%. That is a big difference. You can see, okay, bearing in mind that the clinical attack rate was higher, but the fatality ratio was a lot lower. The clinical fatality ratio was tenfold lower than seen in the Spanish flu. It was a much less lethal strain of flu, and even though it's much worse than seasonal flu, it's a whole different ball game when you're talking about those sorts of levels. These average figures mask the considerable variation by age. And that is to say, again, you can have a case fatality ratio that's very mild for young people and very high, comparatively high for old people. You can have quite a lot of difference. So, these average figures mask the considerable variation by age, most deaths being in the older adult population. However, most illness was in the young. So again, you can have a situation where young people are actually more likely to catch the flu, but old people are much more likely to die of it. So deaths can still be concentrated in the older population, even though there are more young people catching and spreading the flu. And this is often one of the paradoxes in pandemics, that sometimes the people who are good at spreading diseases are not necessarily the people who are most at risk of those diseases. And that is a very common theme, and one that leads to some really interesting ethical and modelling problems, and why age is so very often taken into account in models of pandemic spread. The 1968-69 pandemic came in two waves in the UK, which was unusual in global terms, by which they mean that the rest of the world didn't have the second wave. Second waves can sometimes occur in some countries and not others. And again, it has very much to do with what's going on in that country at the time, human behavior, seasonal patterns in human behavior, as we'll see. In England and Wales, the first wave peaked around February-March 1969, followed by a large peak in the 1969-1970 flu season. Estimates of the national clinical attack rate vary, but based upon comparisons with the epidemic in the United States, it may have been around 35% of the population. Estimates of the case fatality ratio are around 0.2 to 0.4%. These average figures for mortality mask considerable variation by age, with again most deaths being in the older adult population. In this case, however, illness was spread evenly across the age groups. That is to say, young people were getting ill, old people were getting ill, and there wasn't necessarily a big difference in your probability of turning up and saying, "Doctor, I'm feeling ill, I think I've got the pandemic." One of the things it's important to consider in these sorts of situations is how waves can be broken up by seasonal effects. So here you see the large peak kind of coincided with the flu season. And this is something you often expect in seasonal diseases, which is if the pandemic comes at the wrong time and something interrupts it, it kind of can be pushed down a little bit, but as soon as that natural pressure is eased off, the second wave comes along. And that's pretty consistent. That's what we've seen in history. And of course, in this case, it may have been weather, it may have been a mix of other different things. I think they talk about some of those later on. The recent H1N1 2009 pandemic produced no significant signal of excess deaths in the overall population, although approaching 700 people in the UK are known to have died from confirmed H1N1. H1N1 is a way of coding a type of influenza. So basically, influenza viruses have proteins, little molecules on the outside of their shells, and these proteins enable them to attach to human cells and to enter human cells. And the H number and the N number represent categorizations of these different proteins. So two influenza viruses that are in the H1 category will have different H-related proteins, but their overall structure is similar enough to justify categorizing them in the H1 group. And there are quite a large number of these groups. I think it's something like 16 to 19, I'm not sure. But there's a fair number. Not all of them, I think, affect humans, but a fair number do. And a lot of them can, because as we know, viruses do jump from animal to human from time to time, and this, of course, is quite how pandemics actually tend to start. But the point is, if you have two viruses with the same H number, it's very often the case that if you've previously been exposed to one of those influenza viruses with the same H number, you may have a greater resistance, a greater propensity to be able to fight off an influenza virus which has the same H number again. And this is kind of quite useful in considering how influenza behaves, because obviously the seasonal flu comes into the same category. If people have seen waves of the seasonal flu that have the same H number as a pandemic flu, then they may do better in the pandemic. And there does seem to be a kind of a seasonal shift every now and again in the H number that you get in seasonal flu. I think it's H3 that we are mostly getting at the moment in seasonal flu. And I should say, as a technical point, that this particular classification system only applies to influenza A, because there are, of course, above this, 3 different categorizations of influenza A, B, and C, but only influenza A is known to contribute to pandemics and is generally considered the more aggressive and harsh of the group, because it has a greater propensity to mutate. So, back to our text. Case ascertainment is unlikely to have been complete, and the true number is almost certainly higher. Royal College of General Practitioners rates of consultations were highest in the young. There were significant levels of background immunity amongst adults. The epidemic consisted of 2 waves, one immediately following the other. The first wave peaked at the beginning of the school holidays in midsummer, when contact rates in children reduced. Once schools returned in September, infections grew again until mid-October, when there were not enough susceptible individuals left to sustain the pandemic. So that's important to note. Pretty much every pandemic in history has ended when the pandemic ran out of people to infect. That's just the way they end. It's called herd immunity, but that shouldn't be taken to be the kind of aggressive buzzword that it's been used as. It's just a term that means that you have so many people in a group who are resistant or immune to a particular pathogen, but it's no longer able to spread. The probability that it finds someone to jump to before your immune system naturally clears it from your body, or before you die, becomes so low that even though there is a tiny number of people in the population, well, not even necessarily tiny, it can be quite large, 20, 30, 40% of people left in a population who haven't had it and could still catch it. Because so many people have had it, the probability of it bumping into one of those people who haven't, who could catch it, is relatively low. And so it just can't keep going. And we call this herd immunity, and every pandemic in history has ended because of herd immunity. And it's always been herd immunity that is acquired by other people having had the virus. Vaccines take a long time to produce historically, and I don't think we've ever had a vaccine come along in time to prevent a pandemic going to the point where it came pretty close to herd immunity. It simply never happened, as far as I'm aware. Certainly not with influenza pandemics, and they have been historically the pandemics that have killed lots of people and that have spread quite quickly. So yes, there were significant levels of background immunity amongst adults. Yes, that is a point that I was making earlier. So when you have people who have previously had a disease, there has been previously a form of seasonal flu or a pandemic, maybe from the 60s, that was similar to what they have had now in this new pandemic. The older population who have seen that, who were exposed to that virus, are actually better at fighting it off than young people, which is why school children are often very good at spreading viruses, even though their immune systems do quite well at fighting them off. They're very bad at not catching them in the first place. They're very bad at not catching them in the first place, which means they have plenty of opportunities to spread it on to the next person and the next person and the next person, which is why quite often young people, particularly children in influenza, are really good vectors for infectious disease, for influenza. And I think they mentioned that a little bit later, and we'll get to that in a few moments. Yes. The first wave peaked. The first wave peaked at the beginning of the school holidays in mid-summer, when contact rates in children reduced. Once schools returned in September, infections grew again until mid-October, when there were not enough susceptible individuals left to sustain the pandemic. So, yes, schools are really good places for spreading pandemic influenza. And that's why closing schools can be, in influenza, quite an effective strategy. Now, in corona, well, the coronavirus is novel. We don't know to what extent cross-reactivity is. We are effectively talking about a zoonotic strain of the common cold. And when I say zoonotic, I mean a virus that has jumped from animals to human. So we don't know to what extent people have ever seen anything like this before, and it doesn't seem likely that children are likely to be any less resistant to the initial onslaught of a virus than adults, which means that they're not necessarily predisposed to being good spreaders of this virus. But of course, children also have a lot of contact with other children inherently, and so that's also a factor. Yeah. So, estimates of the national clinical attack rate vary. Yes. Estimates of the national clinical attack rate vary. Synthetic case figures used to track the epidemic suggest a clinical attack rate of 1 to 2%. I will admit my ignorance. I do not understand what these synthetic case figures are. I'm assuming it's something that they've used. They've taken some sort of statistical data that was produced at the time, perhaps quite similar to the death rates that we're seeing released by the Department of Health, And then they've applied some set of adjustments, perhaps, to uh, adjust for the fact that they know that some of that information is being missed out, that perhaps deaths in hospitals and cases registered in hospitals are not the whole story. But I don't know exactly how that data was compiled. I don't know how that figure was arrived at. And I don't know if they actually say. I assume it's in the quoted paper. However, modelling suggests that these estimates reflect around only 10% of those infected, which is consistent with serological analysis of the first wave. So serological analysis is when you basically check for antibodies. You look at people's immune systems, you look at what they've got a reaction to, do they have the sort of soup in their blood, in their system, that suggests that they've had this and they are able to respond to it. And that is a good way, or is considered the best, realistically the best way in most cases, of testing to what degree people have actually had the infection, whether or not they've necessarily shown any symptoms. So yeah, if, as is typical for influenza, only half of those infected were symptomatic, though possibly with very mild symptoms, the clinical attack rate would be around 5 to 10%. So yeah, if so, estimates of the case fatality ratio are around 0.01%. In terms of age groups, mortality was spread evenly across the age groups, although most illnesses was in the younger group. An antigenetically similar H1N1 virus was responsible for a significant epidemic of seasonal influenza in 2010/11. So basically, what they are saying is that the case fatality ratio was very, very low. The 2009 pandemic was very, very weak in terms of its impact upon people's health, in terms of its impact upon people's likelihood of dying. Its clinical attack rate was similarly quite low. It's really, it produced no statistical significant signal of excess deaths. It literally, if we hadn't been looking for it, we might not even have known it was there. It might have just been a bad flu season. And indeed, what actually happened is that the H1N1 virus, we think it probably mutated, and next year we saw it in the seasonal influenza season. And this is what happens with all pandemics, we believe. They don't ever really go away. They mutate, and they get into the system, and they go into our seasonal flu cycle, and they become part of a background seasonal flu every year. So they're always mutating to outrun our immune systems, but our immune systems have seen them before and are always catching up. And collectively, they're just not able to cause the huge impact that they do when they're a pandemic and they're not well adapted to the human body, and they are not well known to the human immune system. And there is a sense in which, these illnesses, they do mutate, they coexist with us, and over time they tend to become less dangerous. So, I think I may have bitten off more than I can chew in terms of the amount of material here, so I'm going to go through it a little bit faster now. We're already nearly an hour in, so I shall pick up the pace. The first steps in managing a global pandemic are summarized in the WHO Pandemic Influenza Risk Management Guidance and focus on enhancing surveillance with collection of clinical, virological, and epidemiological data to assess in particular the extent of human-to-human transmission and support interventions to reduce the spread of influenza. So human-to-human transmission is pretty important. Human-to-human transmission has historically not always emerged when we've looked at viruses of concern. You may have heard in the press of influenza strains like H5N1 and H7N9, and other strains mostly circulating in Asia, which were considered to be very, very lethal. They killed a lot of people who got it and who got symptoms. Very nasty viruses. However, they weren't particularly good at spreading from person to person. The people who caught them tended to catch them directly from animals, and it was debatable whether they were actually spreading person to person, and if they were spreading person to person, they weren't doing a very good job of it, we think. Which is why those particular strains of influenza never really escaped from where they started. They didn't really spread very well. But of course, when you do get human-to-human transmission at a reasonable rate, the potential is there for a pandemic. There is a potential for a massive spread. But of course, if that's then coupled with a potential to be lethal, it's that combination that causes a real concern, and that should cause a real concern. And it's that you have to pick up on early, because if you don't figure that out at the early stages, you can very quickly find that it's growing beyond your control, and the opportunities to nip it in the bud before it gets going, they go really quickly. The practicality of such measures depends on effective local planning to identify the first human cases, provide antiviral drugs, and implement quarantine and other social distancing measures. Such measures were not possible in the 2009 pandemic, as there were 6,000 to 32,000 pandemic H1N1 infections in Mexico by late April 2009, when the strain was widely identified and reported. So by the time that people knew about it, it had already spread quite a ways. The healthcare systems that might have picked it up didn't pick it up early enough. The systems that might have held it in bay, antiviral drugs that can help people not catch it, but also reduce the period of time which people can spread it on for. The strict quarantine measures that could stop it from moving from location to location, they were just never put in place. It was all too late. Regardless of whether early containment measures prove to be effective, disease surveillance, including case contact studies, will be required to estimate the importance of disease parameters such as the age-specific clinical attack rates. We're really always, when a pandemic starts, looking for data, looking for information that can tell us how it's going to spread, that can tell us how it's going to behave. We want to know who's going to get it. We want to try and predict. What the propensity of different age groups are to getting it, to spreading it. The household secondary attack rate is quite important, as I say. And in fact, it kind of tells you how likely someone who lives in the same house as someone who's got it is to get it, and it's typically quite high. If one person in the house gets it, the probability that everybody gets it is generally pretty high. But it's important to know, particularly if you have cultures or certain parts of your population that have quite crowded houses. If you have two people in a house, then there's a 75% chance that somebody gets it. If they live with someone, they probably got it. If you have 10 people living in a house and one person gets it, well, actually, there might be a significant portion of them that haven't got it. And you have to ask yourself a question: can you partition them from each other somehow? What can you do? Difficult questions to be asked and answered. The household secondary attack rate, the infection severity rates, as well as descriptions of the clinical pattern, that is to say, the symptoms that you would look for in trying to diagnose it, trying to trace it, because obviously testing isn't always available at the early stage, and it's quite important for you to be able to continue to pick it up even when testing isn't available. It is uncertain exactly how long it will take to derive reasonable initial estimates for these and other key parameters. If a disease is recognised early and takes 2 to 4 weeks to spread to the UK, initial upper bound estimates of the mortality rate may be available by the time it reaches the UK. So basically, we would like to know how deadly it's going to be before it gets here. You don't want to be throwing out the baby with the bathwater and taking really extreme measures if it is not that lethal, like the 2009 pandemic. But on the other hand, if it is pretty lethal, you want to move quickly. And that is, of course, always the question. And it's not an easy question to answer, necessarily. But it can be if you've got really good data. More useful estimates may not be available until there have been significant cases in the UK. So obviously, these things are very dependent upon patterns of behaviour and patterns of social contact. How a virus will spread in a dense population is going to be different to how it spreads in a less dense population. The age demographics of a population are going to have an effect, and you won't know for sure exactly how a virus is going to spread in a population until it gets there and starts spreading. And it's that early data that can be really useful in constructing models. Clinical attack rates and therefore case fatality ratios are particularly difficult to estimate, so accurate estimates of these parameters may take longer to derive. It is important to ensure mechanisms are in place to measure rates of infection in the community at different stages of a pandemic to enable this to be possible. There's a lot of material here. I'm wondering if I should maybe skip this. I'm going to skip some of this. Right. Low-level restrictions in international travel would have a minimal impact. Even relatively high levels of travel restrictions would only delay an epidemic for a few weeks. For instance, imposing a 90% restriction on all air travel to the UK would delay the peak of a pandemic wave by only 1 to 4 weeks. A 99.9% travel restriction might delay the pandemic wave by 2 months. Travel restrictions into the UK from country of origin will be compromised by travel into the UK from intermediate countries that develop their own epidemics. Regional travel restrictions into the UK will be increasingly disruptive for relatively little benefit. If restrictions on travel from all countries which had epidemics of pandemic flu were put in place internationally, I just say in all countries, not just our own, the effects could be somewhat greater. A 90% reduction might delay the spread by 3 to 4 weeks, a 99.9% effective ban by 3 to 4 months. If the UK has cases early in the pandemic, then this would involve travel restrictions out of the UK. While clearly possible in principle for all practical levels of restriction, there is very little chance of a country missing the pandemic altogether due to travel restrictions. Screening is less effective than restricting travel generally. Preventing those with clinical symptoms from travelling is only likely to delay the spread of the disease by 1 to 2 weeks. Assuming passengers are screened before travel for clinical symptoms, there is very little additional advantage in entry screening. Screening on entry to the UK poses considerable policy questions, whether potential cases are quarantined, and planning. It requires considerable resources and is not recommended. So effectively, you're going to get the pandemic whatever you do. If it's spreading globally, which is what pandemic means, you're going to get it. The only way is to kind of do a whole kind of total isolationist policy where you shut the border and you no point screening flights. You've got to basically say no one in, no one out kind of approach. Once you've got a few cases in your country circulating without being contacted and contained, without you really knowing about what they're doing and who they're interacting with, it's going to spread. And typically it's going to spread in multiple population centres, because there's travel in and out of the country in multiple population centres around the UK. Even in regards to air travel, there's London airports, Heathrow, Gatwick, but there's also Manchester Airport, there's Leeds Bradford Airport, there's an airport up in Newcastle, there's the Robin Hood Airport in Doncaster. There's all those people coming in and out of the UK at multiple locations, and all of them are going to produce a few cases of people who have the coronavirus. They're going to come into the UK and they're going to spread it around. And unless you basically stop it all, you're not going to stop the virus getting in. And once you've got a few cases in, slamming down the brakes and saying no more people coming in, it's basically shutting the door after the horse has bolted. So that is why it's not, and that's why traveling between regions is not necessarily that helpful either. In that it can delay things slightly, but it's not gonna stop any part of the country from getting it. That's not how it works. Geographical development of a pandemic within the UK. It has been estimated that a pandemic flu outbreak would be expected to have been seeded through international travel and internal travel in most major UK centres of population within 1 to 2 weeks of the earliest importations. So, I mean, this is not an influenza pandemic, but that would have been February sometime, if not sooner. Modelling studies suggest since 2006, using broadly similar modelling approaches, have reached essentially equivalent conclusions for the UK and some other European countries. It would take some further time to show significant activity across the country, as was seen in 2009, because obviously these growth curves are exponential. They peter off being quite flat, and then suddenly they go whoosh and get really high quite suddenly. Large population centres are likely to be seeded with more cases early on during the pandemic. For example, 57% of international travellers visit London, and 75% of visitors going to London, Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, Bristol, Glasgow, and Edinburgh. So basically, yeah, there's a reason London is ahead of the curve in the pandemic, and that is because they got a higher exposure from people coming in from abroad early on. And that relatively small number of extra people coming at a very early stage has basically pushed them ahead, because at those very early stages, a few extra people actually makes a big difference. Significant exceeding is expected from UK residents returning from abroad. Hence, at early stages of a pandemic, case numbers may be large in urban areas. Such differences in case numbers will primarily reflect the timing of the start of the local outbreak, as opposed to a larger overall clinical attack rate. So basically, it's very usual that you see that once pandemics get going, different cities, different population centres, they tend to be out of sync with each other, like their pandemics have started at different times. And in a sense, that's what's happened, because the initial growth has kind of kicked off when the number of people in that region has reached a kind of critical point. And that critical point is reached so much sooner if you have more cases early on. Because of the probable multiple importations of pandemic flu and the concentration of the population in cities, attempts at containment by antiviral prophylaxis and practical social distancing measures are almost certain to fail. Even very substantial reductions in internal travel between localities, say 90%. So, I don't know, what would that look like? Imagine they cancelled all of the trains and closed the motorways, that sort of thing. Would have little effect on the length and peak size of the epidemic in each local area. However, coupled with the elimination of international travel, they could spread out the national epidemic by desynchronizing the epidemics in local areas. Such restrictions are probably impractical. More realistic reductions in such travel would have negligible effects on the national epidemic. What we know about the impact of an unmitigated pandemic. Local epidemics in clinical commissioning group sized areas. Now, a clinical commissioning group is a unit used in the NHS. It's kind of it's basically where the money is paid from in a realistic sense. So, if your treatment is being paid for, if you're being referred to a specialist, it's paid for by the clinical commissioning group. And it generally covers a large metropolitan area like Leeds or that sort of city-sized area is typically a clinical commissioning group. Local epidemics in clinical commissioning group-sized areas would be expected to be more highly peaked than the national epidemic. That is to say, if you've got all of these different pandemics going on locally and they're all slightly out of sync, the peak nationally is a collective of a lot of slightly smaller peaks spread out over time. So each individual local area's peak is going to be a bit sharper. Similarly, they would be expected to be of shorter duration, perhaps by a third, than the national epidemic. Empirical evidence from 1918 suggests, however, that there may also be a large variation in epidemic profile from CCG to CCG. That is to say, some places had 2 waves, some places didn't necessarily have 2 waves, some places slightly different timing of them. 2/3 of modern clinical commissioning group sized areas had less peaked rates of mortality that suggested by the national planning profile, and a third more highly peaked mortality. So that is to say, the sharpness of the peaks also varies by location. The UK case fatality ratio, remember that's the number of people who die out of those number of people, the ratio of the number of people who die out of those people who would be diagnosed with the disease. For 4 pandemics in the last 100 years was of the order to 0.01 to 2%. In contrast, recent estimates for the case fatality ratio of H5N1 avian flu are of the order of 50 to 60%. So people were really worried about H5N1 at one point, because it is really quite lethal, and 50% is probably an overestimate. There's some good research to suggest, I think it might be closer to 12% was a number I saw thrown around when they did a bit more research, but that's still horrendous compared to 2%. And so there was real consternation about that in the world in general, for those among us who were actually paying attention to pandemics and influenza. But of course, that was tempered by the fact that we knew it was really bad at spreading. Based on historical pandemics, a reasonable worst case for a pandemic, that's a very important term and you'll see a lot, reasonable worst case. So what is a reasonable worst case? I've heard lots of different theories about that terminology. For these purposes, I imagine you could interpret it as meaning the worst case that any government could reasonably be expected to prepare for. I mean, we could always say, yes, tomorrow an asteroid will land and the dinosaurs will all die and the zombie plague will happen and everyone will be turned into zombies, but would that be reasonable? The reasonable worst case for a pandemic would be a case fatality ratio of 2.5%, according to this document. However, even if the estimates for H5N1 avian flu are overestimates for a naturally occurring viral strain adapted for efficient human-to-human transmission, a H5N1 pandemic would be expected to be towards the higher end of a range of historically observed case fatality ratios. See, this is the thing, when zoonotic viruses adapt to human beings, they typically become less lethal as the adaptation takes hold, as they mutate. That is a pattern that's quite often seen in influenza viruses, and there is some evidence to suggest that that's somewhat linked to cytokine storms and their ability to hide from the human immune system, and their ability to not provoke the human immune system to the point where it kills you, which is ironically the better the virus is and also their ability to replicate inside of cells. It is a paradoxical thing, which is the better the virus becomes at living inside of you, the less likely it becomes to kill you, which is quite paradoxical when you think about it. A pandemic with a case fatality ratio above 2.5% cannot be ruled out. Mortality rates often vary by age. Age-specific mortality curves for 1957, 58, and 1968 to 69 show a U-shaped pattern. So again, you get that kind of high level among infants and that high level among the elderly, and it kind of plateaus for people in the kind of middle age and youth. The 1918 pandemic, on the other hand, had a more equal spread mortality rate, with particularly high mortality rates seen in young adults. Again, those kind of 20-somethings coming back from the war, and also young women and people also at home, but that kind of young 20s, 30s kind of age rate got hit much more than you'd expect. For the well-documented, we're not going to read that bit. Clinical attack rates may vary by age, both due to different mixing patterns between age groups, as well as partial immunity that can be distributed unevenly between age groups. Again, if you previously lived through another influenza strain and you were exposed to it, you might have more resistance. Illness generally peaks in school children or young adults. So that is to say, the big spreaders tend to be school children and young adults. The provision of good background serology data will be key to providing estimates of initial immunity, that is to say how many people might already have some inbuilt resistance to this, which will be important in estimating the clinical attack rate. Contact tracing, including serological and virological testing of contacts of the first few hundred cases in the UK. Community surveys and individual outbreak analysis will be essential for accurate determination of disease parameters. So the point, we've heard a lot about contact tracing and how it can be used in the press recently to try and limit a pandemic, to try and stop it spreading. How you might be able to see people who've been infected, follow them, find the people they've had contact with, and basically quarantine them before they can give it to someone else. That's important, but more often what you're actually doing with contact tracing is finding people after they've already got it, and they've probably already spread it onto somebody else as well. But you get data from that. You get usable data that you can use to help improve your models, that you can use to help improve your ability to predict how the pandemic's going to behave. And that can be the difference between picking one policy option over another, taking one approach to limiting the pandemic over another. And that data is important. That data can be really, really useful. Given a cumulative 50% attack rate over a single wave, as in the reasonable worst case discussed above, absence directly due to illness would be expected to peak at 17% for 2 to 3 weeks at the height of the epidemic. So at your peak, the kind of the middle of a pandemic, when things are at their worst, 17% of people probably not coming into work, which obviously is a huge rate of absenteeism, but I mean, compared to what we're seeing now in lockdown, probably not that big. I wouldn't know. I will at some point, I'm sure, be going through figures on that, but not right now. Employers should also be advised to take account of the possibility of local, geographical, behavioural and temporal variations. Small organisational units should plan for a higher level of absence of 30 to 35%. For a typical organisation, additional absences due to those who need to stay at home to look after ill children might be expected to increase absenteeism from 17 to 20%. And of course, that is one of the things about closing schools. If you do close schools, is you get that higher rate of absenteeism from people staying at home to look after their kids, which has always been part of the modelling. It's explicitly stated as part of the modelling here. But yeah, we're seeing the real effects of it now. What we know about the impacts of pharmaceutical countermeasures. This is the really interesting thing about pandemics. There are things that you can do in an influenza pandemic. We know that there are interventions that can be made, medical interventions, that are meaningful. Perhaps not necessarily as helpful in corona. And that is one of the big things that has perhaps, being that this is a corona epidemic, but we've never really seen a corona pandemic before, some of the strategy, some of the understanding directed towards influenza pandemics not immediately applicable. So for example, antibiotics are used to treat bacterial infections that might be exacerbated or initiated by influenza viral infections. Antibiotics reduce the morbidity and mortality subsequent to influenza infections, but they do not impact on transmission. So antibiotics cannot kill viruses. That's why they're called antibiotics. They're anti against bacteria. However, viruses can leave your lungs susceptible to bacterial infections. And if you have a viral infection in your lung, you can get a bacterial infection subsequently that can actually do more damage than a viral infection. And a significant number of people who die from an influenza pandemic actually die from a secondary bacterial infection. And so having plenty of antibiotics around is really helpful and can help reduce the number of lethalities considerably to a meaningful extent. Antivirals can reduce the duration and severity of influenza symptoms. I don't know. I will admit my ignorance again. I don't know to what extent coronavirus is causing secondary bacterial infections. And actually, although I haven't reviewed the clinical evidence in the literature, although I'm sure it's accumulating quickly, I wouldn't be surprised to find out that there's still some uncertainty about this. Antivirals can reduce the duration and severity of influenza symptoms. A policy of rapid treatment of those ill is the most efficient use of antivirals for stockpiles corresponding to the treatment courses for less than 50% of the population. If the available stock is less than the clinical attack rate of influenza-like illness, it will be necessary to limit treatment to priority groups. So basically, antivirals can do a number of things. They can make you less likely to catch the disease if they're taken prophylactically. That is to say, if you give it to people who you don't think are likely to have it, just because you want them to not catch the disease, if you have enough to do that. But they can also shorten the length of the disease, so it can help people recover faster. Sometimes they can also help reduce the severity of the disease. That is to say, they can help stop people dying. Influenza, we haven't always seen the impact on severity that we'd like with antivirals, but they are quite good at shortening the course of a disease. And of course, if you shorten the course of a disease, you reduce the window of time in which someone has an opportunity to give the virus to someone else. And that's quite a powerful effect. So that process where if you have a lot of symptomatic individuals and you get them quite early on in their course of their disease to take the antiviral, you can help reduce the likelihood that they pass it on to somebody else. Brings the overall rate of infection down, very much like social distancing, but of course, you only really need to give people a pill, provided you have enough of said pills. We don't have any effective antivirals for corona, not yet. It's being actively researched at great speed. So yeah, that is a hot area of current research to see about whether we can do that. Because if we could reduce the severity of people in the most lethal cases, or maybe triage it to people who have the virus, and we really, really want to make sure that they don't pass it on to people, that could really have a big impact on the progress of a pandemic. However, mass treatment of clinical cases with antivirals could flatten the temporal profile, lowering the peak and lengthening the base. So it can flatten the curve, basically. If there is a high take-up of treatment. In 2009, fewer of those infected were treated in the period of mass treatment because fewer of those infected consulted the healthcare system. So basically, there was this thing called the National Pandemic Flu Service, and they would basically send you drugs. They would send you antivirals you could take at home, and I think the message was at the time very much, take your meds, stay home. Very few people did, because very few people felt ill enough to feel that they had to go to the doctor. Because few of those infected consulted the healthcare system, hence the overall impact of antivirals on transmission and in turn the clinical attack rate was negligible in 2009. So yeah, although the main purpose of antiviral treatment is to reduce the severity of the disease, treating all clinical cases with antivirals might also decrease the overall attack rate. There is considerable uncertainty over the extent of reduction possible. Some models suggest a relative reduction of up to 1/3. This suggests, for example, that treating all cases in an outbreak for which the attack rate would be 50% without treatment would require enough antiviral courses for 35% of a population. So these are not small amounts of drugs you need. This is quite considerable amounts to use them in the ways that are being talked about. Mass provision of antivirals to the population would simply postpone the outbreak by the period for which the prophylaxis is provided. However, such mass prophylaxis would deplete antiviral stocks very quickly. So basically, if you're going to hand out antivirals to everyone, you've got to hand out antivirals to everyone for a very, very long time. Because much like flattening the curve, it extends the length of a pandemic. And until people have had the virus, they're not immune to it, they need to keep taking the antivirals to make sure they don't get it. If the point of the antiviral is to stop people getting the virus, to make them more resistant to it, then obviously their immune systems never have to adapt to the virus. They don't get the immunity, and they have to keep taking the antivirals in order for the effect to be sustained. Whereas, of course, if you kind of triage the antivirals for people who've already had the infection to shorten the course, at least they then get immunity afterwards. And you also get the added benefit that they go on to infect fewer people, hopefully, if the length of the infection is shortened. Another possible practical use of antivirals is prophylaxis of essential workers, leading to a possible 2/3 reduction in both peak and total clinical attack rates for the groups receiving prophylaxis. So clearly we don't want NHS workers to get ill while we're trying to fight a pandemic. And so that would be really a sensible way to triage the drugs, potentially. The cost in terms of antiviral treatment courses would be large. For example, around half of the current Tamiflu stock for frontline NHS workers alone. So basically, they're talking about a 50% increase in the current stock. And Tamiflu is only one antiviral, so it should be pointed out that different forms of influenza are potentially have different susceptibilities, different responses to different antivirals. And so it is possible to get a form of influenza turn up that's not amenable, doesn't really get as affected as strongly by the antiviral that you happen to have on hand. I don't think so. Yeah, Tamiflu is the one that we had in the UK in 2009, and we basically gave out a lot of them to people. And in fact, we had so much of the stuff at the end of a pandemic that we just started giving them out quite quickly because it had a sell-by date, I believe, as I recall. That's what I recall reading in the press. There was a bit of a sell-by date on Tamiflu, and we didn't want to waste it, so we kind of became very relaxed about giving it out, as I recall, after the pandemic. A further problem is that, unlike those treated, those who receive prophylaxis for the duration of the first wave and do not develop clinical or subclinical infection would not be immune to the start of the second wave. So basically, yeah, if you've missed the pandemic, but the pandemic because of antivirals, but the pandemic hasn't gone away, you're gonna get it when it comes back in the second wave, or when you get reinfected, re-exposed. Stockpile levels over 50% are sufficient to allow post-exposure prophylactic options to be considered. Post-exposure antiviral prophylaxis of the household contacts of cases could have a more marked impact on the disease than simply treatment of cases. So basically, we know you have a very high rate of catching an infectious disease like influenza if you live in the same house as someone who's got it, and so giving someone drugs, antiviral drugs, to try and prevent them from getting it is going to have more of an effect. And also, you've probably already got it, so it might as well, you've probably already got it and you're at an early stage, or you're going to be asymptomatic, so it's, going to shorten the course of the infection, hopefully, and you might even still be immune. In the 2009 pandemic, a combination of treatment of index cases and household prophylaxis reduced the clinical attack rate in households from 10.6 to 4.5, were given within 48 hours of illness onset in the index case, that is to say, the person we think got it first. Such household prophylaxis would be more effective in mitigating and delaying the progress of the epidemic than antiviral treatment alone. Given any stockpile sufficiently large for household prophylaxis to be a possible option, starting with prophylaxis and, if necessary, reverting to treatment and if necessary, targeted treatment of at-risk groups is likely to result in the smallest number of deaths. So basically they're saying you might want to start giving it out to people in households who get it, and then maybe triage it a little bit later on when you're starting to run a bit low. On the other hand, the greatest reduction in peak attack rate is more likely to be obtained by continuing the household prophylaxis strategy to stockpile exhaustion. So again, there's that notion of it. So there is that worry about the peak and how high can the peak get? Can the peak get high enough that the health system can't cope with it? At onset of a pandemic influenza epidemic in the UK, there will not be a good vaccine that matches the characteristics of the new virus. Prior vaccination with a poorly matched pre-pandemic vaccine and antibiotic treatment of those with complications would help control the overall impact on hospitalizations and deaths. Scenarios given here have a conservative assumption that a pre-pandemic vaccine has only 20% efficacy, indicating indicative numbers of cases, hospitalizations, and deaths for the different scenarios are shown in Appendix 1. So basically, a pre-pandemic vaccine is a vaccine that's very poorly matched to the virus you've got. As I've said, in influenza, there is this phenomenon where if you have something with the same H type, you can have some protection from having previously seen that virus, and something similar holds for vaccines. However, there are so many different H types, the probability of you having that particular pre-pandemic vaccine on hand in reasonable quantities is questionable. How many different H types are you going to store a pre-pandemic vaccine of? There is no vaccine for coronavirus. Coronavirus is a common cold. No one's ever made a vaccine for it. There's never been a corona pandemic in humans as far as I'm aware before. I don't think anyone has ever seen that before or hypothesized. There's SARS and there's MERS, which weren't pandemics, and we never got a vaccine for them. They could have become pandemics, but they didn't. But pre-pandemic vaccines, quite a lot of the time you're going to get the vaccine, it's going to do nothing. But even if 20% of people who get the vaccine still get immunity, that still has enough impact. That still has enough of an impact to make a real difference. Stockpiling enough pre-pandemic vaccine for 40% of the UK population would allow a targeted strategy of vaccination of all those aged 16 or under and all those aged 65 or over. So basically those most likely to spread it and those most likely to die from it. Vaccinating school-aged children may be highly effective in reducing transmission, but only if vaccine is available early enough in the pandemic, since rapid transmission in this group means that many will already have been infected and acquired natural immunity before a pandemic vaccine is likely to become available.